Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine being called a failure your whole life, never living up to expectations, always feeling like an afterthought in your own family, only to have those same people come crawling back the moment they needed something. That was my reality, the exhausting, suffocating weight of never being enough, of never being wanted in the way my brother, Eric, had always been. I had spent my entire childhood chasing approval that would never come, pushing myself harder, working longer, achieving more, all in the desperate hope that one day my parents might finally look at me with pride instead of thinly veiled disappointment. But no matter what I did, no matter how much I succeeded, it was never good enough, because in their eyes, I was nothing more than a shadow standing next to the golden sun they had placed on a pedestal from the moment he was born. For years, I tried to convince myself that if I just worked a little harder, if I just proved my worth a little more, they would finally see me as something other than a burden, something other than the child who had never quite measured up. But the final blow came when I needed them most, when I stood before them, vulnerable and desperate for support, and they made their choice without a moment's hesitation. I had landed the opportunity of a lifetime, a job that would have changed everything for me, a position that could have set me up for the future I had spent years building toward, but I needed help just long enough to get on my feet. I had asked for nothing my entire life, had never leaned on them the way Eric had never expected them to bail me out the way they always did for him, but the one time I reached out, the one time I swallowed my pride and admitted I needed something, they looked me in the eye and told me no. Not because they couldn't help, not because they truly didn't have the means, but because Eric had asked for something first, and his needs would always come before mine. That was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that I was nothing more than an obligation to them, a mistake they had tolerated out of necessity rather than love. So I walked away, severed the ties that had been strangling me for so long, cut them out of my life without looking back, and for the first time, I felt something close to freedom. Years passed, years in which I built myself into someone they had never believed I could be, years in which I found success on my own terms, years in which I finally understood that I didn't need their validation to be whole. I had peace, real peace, the kind that comes from knowing you owe no one anything, from knowing you are free from the weight of expectations that were never meant for you in the first place. And then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was my father's name flashing across the screen, the man who had spent my entire life looking at me like I was a disappointment, like I was something less, like I would never be worthy of the same care and affection he so easily showered on my brother. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting with something sharp and bitter, my pulse thrumming with the kind of unease that comes from knowing something is about to change, from knowing that nothing good ever comes from a ghost reaching out from the past. Against my better judgment, against the voice in my head screaming at me to let it go to voicemail, I answered. His voice was, as I remembered, calm, controlled, distant in that way that made it seem like he was speaking to an acquaintance rather than his own daughter. He didn't ask how I was, didn't bother with small talk or pleasantries, didn't make even the smallest effort to pretend that this call was about anything other than what he needed from me. "Your mother is sick," he said, his tone flat, almost emotionless, as if he were delivering a simple fact rather than a plea for help. "We need you to pay the bills." The words hit like a punch to the gut, the sheer audacity of them momentarily knocking the breath from my lungs, the expectation so casual, so absolute, as if it were my responsibility, as if I owed them something after all these years, as if they had any right to demand anything from me after everything they had done. I should have hung up right then, should have laughed in his face, should have reminded him that I was nothing to them until it was convenient, but instead, I found myself frozen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I started, my voice hoarse, my mind struggling to process the sheer entitlement dripping from his words, but before I could even attempt to form a response, he delivered the final blow. The one that shattered whatever lingering doubt I might have had about where I stood in his eyes. "You owe us for everything we did for you." Oh! As if my entire existence was a debt to be repaid, as if raising me had been some unbearable burden they had suffered through, as if I had never been a child who deserved love, but rather an investment they expected a return on. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I sat there in silence, my heart pounding in my ears, my thoughts racing, my pulse thrumming with something dark and unshakable. And in that moment, I made a decision, one that would ensure they never saw me as a lifeline ever again. Have your parents ever made you feel like you were never enough, no matter how hard you tried, no matter how much you achieved, no matter how much of yourself you gave to them? Have you ever spent your entire childhood chasing approval that never came, pushing yourself to the breaking point just for a single moment of recognition, only to realize that it was never about you, that no matter what you did, no matter how much you sacrificed, you would always come second to someone else? I learned that lesson early, long before I understood the words for what it was, long before I could name the weight of it, long before I realized that I had spent years trying to earn the love of people who had never truly seen me as anything other than an obligation. Growing up, my parents made it painfully clear that I was not the child they had wanted, that I was not the one they had placed all their hopes and dreams on, that my existence was, at best, something to tolerate and, at worst, something to resent. My brother, Eric, on the other hand, could do no wrong, could make mistakes without consequence, could fail and still be held up as the shining example of everything a child was supposed to be. It didn't matter that I worked harder, that I studied longer, that I won awards and earned scholarships and fought for every single success that came my way, because none of it compared to the simple fact that Eric existed, that he was their pride and joy, that he was the son they had always wanted, while I was nothing more than the afterthought standing in his shadow. I still remember the way my mother's face would tighten whenever I accomplished something, the way her praise always came through gritted teeth, the way her compliments felt more like obligations than genuine pride. I remember how my father would brush off my successes with barely a nod, how he would shift the conversation back to Eric as if my achievements were nothing more than background noise, as if my hard work was insignificant compared to the simple fact that Eric was their golden child. It was never more obvious than the day I came home, beaming with excitement, holding the acceptance letter that was supposed to change my life, the one that confirmed I had been chosen for a prestigious internship that would open doors I had only ever dreamed of. I had worked for years to get to that moment, had sacrificed sleep and sanity, had pushed myself harder than I thought possible, and I had walked into that house believing, for just 1 second, that maybe, just maybe, this time they would finally see me. But before I could even finish telling them the news, before I could even put the letter down, my mother sighed heavily and muttered, "That's great, dear, but Eric just got promoted." And just like that, my moment was gone, swept away like it had never mattered in the first place, overshadowed by yet another reason why Eric was the child they had always wanted, the child who would always come first, the child whose life was worth celebrating while mine was something they barely tolerated. That was the moment something inside me broke, the moment I realized I could spend the rest of my life trying to earn their love, and it would never be enough, the moment I decided I was done chasing after something I would never have. I packed my bags, walked out of that house, and never looked back, never reached out, never let them pull me back into the cycle of disappointment and rejection that had shaped my entire existence. I thought I had escaped, thought I had finally freed myself from the weight of their expectations, thought I had built a life so far removed from them that they would never be able to reach me again. But now, sitting across from them in the dimly lit cafe they had chosen for this meeting, I realized how foolish I had been to think they would ever truly let me go. My father looked older, his face more lined, his shoulders heavier with the years that had passed, but there was no warmth in his eyes as he slid a thick folder across the table, no hesitation as he gestured to the stack of medical bills neatly tucked inside. My mother, sitting beside him, still carried that same sharpness in her gaze, the same quiet disapproval, the same unshakable belief that I had somehow failed them by choosing my own life over the one they had planned for me. "We need you to take care of this," my father said, his voice flat, businesslike, as if this were nothing more than a routine transaction, as if he were assigning me a task rather than asking for help. As if I were still the child he could command rather than the adult who had long since walked away. I felt my mother's gaze sweep over me, her lips pursed, her expression unreadable, but somehow still managing to radiate disappointment, still managing to make me feel like I had failed at something I had never agreed to in the first place. "You're doing well for yourself, aren't you?" she asked, her tone light, but laced with something sharper, something accusatory, something that made it clear she had no interest in my answer beyond what it meant for them. "You have a good job, a stable life. It's not like this would be difficult for you." I should have been angry, should have thrown the folder back in their faces, should have laughed at the sheer audacity of the people who had spent years treating me like a burden, now expecting me to save them from the consequences of their own choices. But instead, I smiled, slow and deliberate, leaning back in my chair as I picked up the folder, flipping through the pages with careful consideration, nodding as if I were truly thinking it over, as if I were weighing my options, as if I had any intention of giving them what they wanted. "All right," I said finally, my voice calm, controlled, the hint of something unreadable curling at the edges of my words. "I'll pay." My father exhaled slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing, my mother's lips twitching upward in the faintest hint of satisfaction, both of them so certain they had won, so convinced that I had fallen back into the role they had always expected me to play. But I continued, closing the folder with a quiet snap, my smile never wavering, my voice never breaking, my next words sending a flicker of uncertainty through their carefully composed expressions. "On one condition." The moment the words left my mouth, I saw the flicker of suspicion flash across my father's face, his jaw tightening slightly, his fingers twitching against the table as if he was already bracing himself for whatever came next. My mother, on the other hand, was less controlled, her lips pressing into a thin line, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the irritation she was trying to keep in check, the barely concealed frustration of realizing that this wasn't going to be as simple as they had hoped. They had come here expecting me to fold the moment they put the weight of obligation on my shoulders, had assumed that all it would take was the right combination of guilt and expectation to make me comply without question. But I wasn't that person anymore, wasn't the desperate child who once clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would finally see me if I did enough for them. "What kind of condition?" my father asked, his voice measured, his posture stiff, his eyes locked onto mine with the careful calculation of a man who had spent his life believing he was always the one in control of the conversation. I could see the way he was already trying to find the angle, already working through the possibilities in his head, already preparing for whatever negotiation he assumed was coming. I smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly as if I were still considering my words, as if I hadn't already planned this down to the last detail. "It's simple," I said, keeping my tone light, almost casual, as if this were just another ordinary discussion, as if I wasn't about to set the stage for something they would never see coming. "If I'm going to pay these bills, I want full transparency. That means I get access to everything, the hospital records, the insurance details, the exact breakdown of what's owed and why. If I'm footing the bill, I want to know exactly where my money is going." My mother scoffed, shaking her head slightly as she let out a sharp breath, the exasperation bleeding through her expression, the barely restrained irritation making it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. "For God's sake," she muttered, rolling her eyes as if I were a petulant child making unreasonable demands. "Why do you have to make this so complicated? We wouldn't be asking if it wasn't necessary." I raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to watch the first signs of discomfort creep into her features, just long enough for my father's fingers to tighten against the table, just long enough for them both to realize that I wasn't backing down. "Then there shouldn't be any problem with me verifying it, right?" I said, my voice still calm, still controlled, still carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who is done playing games. "If everything is exactly how you say it is, this will just be a formality. Unless, of course, there's something you're not telling me." The shift in the air was subtle but undeniable, the kind of tension that settled in the space between words, the kind of hesitation that said more than any argument ever could. My father exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering to my mother in that quiet, unspoken way that married couples communicate when they're trying to gauge whether or not they've just lost control of a situation. My mother, never one to let silence linger for too long, was the first to recover, shaking her head as she forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped, her words just a little too fast, just a little too sharp. "If that's what it takes for you to stop making this more difficult than it needs to be, then fine." I nodded as if I were satisfied, as if I had gotten exactly what I wanted, as if I wasn't already 3 steps ahead of them, already setting the wheels in motion for something they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. The moment I left that cafe, I didn't waste any time. I contacted the hospital, explained the situation, and requested full financial disclosure under the condition that I was the one who would be handling the payments. It didn't take long to get the documents, didn't take long for the numbers to start rolling in, didn't take long for me to start noticing the discrepancies, the inconsistencies, the quiet little omissions that they had conveniently left out when presenting their carefully crafted story. They had lied about the full cost, had exaggerated the amount owed, had twisted the truth just enough to make it seem urgent, just enough to make me believe that they were drowning when, in reality, they were just trying to squeeze as much out of me as they could before I asked too many questions. And that wasn't even the worst of it. I dug deeper, made a few more calls, pulled a few more strings, and what I found made my stomach twist with something sharp, something bitter, something dangerously close to satisfaction. My father had been gambling. Not just small bets, not just harmless wagers, but real, significant losses, debts that had been building up under the surface, debts that had been carefully concealed beneath the more pressing issue of my mother's medical bills, debts that he had likely hoped to cover before I had the chance to find out. And Eric, the golden child, the one they had always put first, the one they had built their entire world around, had given them nothing. Not a dime, not an ounce of effort, not even the pretense of concern. He had left them to fend for themselves, had turned his back the moment they became an inconvenience, had disappeared the second they stopped being useful to him. The irony was almost laughable, the poetic justice of it so sharp it nearly cut. After all those years of being told I wasn't enough, of being treated like I was the lesser child, of being cast aside in favor of their beloved son, it was me they had come to in the end, me they had expected to clean up their mess. Me they had assumed would take responsibility when their favorite child refused to lift a finger. I let the truth settle, let it sink deep into my bones, let the weight of it solidify something inside me, something colder, something sharper, something that had been waiting far too long to finally be unleashed. If they thought they could manipulate me, if they thought they could use me, if they thought I would simply fall in line the way I had when I was younger, they had no idea what was coming. Because now I had the upper hand. And I was about to make them regret ever thinking they could control me. I had spent my entire life watching my parents bend over backward for Eric, making excuses for him when he failed, handing him opportunities he never earned, praising him for things I had done better, acting as though his mere existence was some kind of accomplishment that outweighed every success I had ever fought for. It had been years since I had seen him, years since I had spoken to him, years since I had finally accepted that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, no matter how much I sacrificed, I would never be their priority because that position had been reserved for him from the moment he was born. But now, with the truth laid out before me in cold, undeniable numbers, with the reality of their lies sitting heavy in my chest, I decided it was time for them to face the consequences of the choices they had made. They had expected me to take care of them without question, had assumed I would step up without hesitation, had counted on my sense of obligation to make me fall in line like I always had before. But if I was supposed to be their backup plan, if I was meant to clean up their mess when their golden son failed to come through for them, then it was time to drag him into the conversation, time to force them to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth they had been avoiding. So I called him, sent him a simple message with no explanation, told him to meet us at the hospital for a financial discussion about our parents' bills. He didn't ask questions, didn't argue, didn't try to get out of it, probably assumed I was the one footing the bill and that his presence was nothing more than a formality. Just another opportunity for him to play the part of the concerned son without actually having to contribute anything. When I arrived at the hospital, my parents were already seated in the small, sterile meeting room, my father with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, my mother flipping through the stack of documents in front of her as if she actually understood the financial disaster she had been trying to hide from me. They barely acknowledged me when I walked in, barely spared me a glance, too focused on their own worries to even attempt the usual niceties. But when the door opened again and Eric strolled inside, their heads snapped up so fast you would have thought they had seen a ghost. My mother was the first to react, her face lighting up in genuine relief, her shoulders sagging slightly as if his mere presence was enough to assure her that everything was about to be fixed, that everything would be okay now that their beloved son was here. My father, ever the composed one, didn't say anything at first, but I saw the way his fingers twitched slightly against the table, the way his gaze flickered between me and Eric, the way he was already trying to calculate why I had brought him here. What my angle was, what I was planning. Eric, my mother breathed, reaching for his hand, squeezing it as if she hadn't just spent the last week acting as though he didn't exist, as if she hadn't just been begging me to take responsibility for everything, as if she hadn't conveniently forgotten that she had another child until the moment he was standing in front of her. "I didn't know you were coming, sweetheart." Eric shot me a look, clearly unimpressed with whatever situation I had dragged him into, clearly annoyed that he had been summoned to deal with something he had no interest in. "Yeah, well," he muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets, his posture lazy, indifferent, completely unconcerned. "She said it was important, so here I am." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, letting my gaze sweep over my parents slowly, deliberately, giving them just enough time to feel the weight of what was coming. "Funny," I said, my voice light, casual, carrying the faintest edge of something sharp enough to cut. "You never mentioned asking Eric for help. You never told him about any of this, did you?" The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, stretching long enough that I could see the moment my mother's expression faltered, the moment my father's fingers tightened against the arm of his chair, the moment Eric's jaw tensed as he realized exactly what was happening. "What the hell is she talking about?" Eric demanded, his gaze snapping to them, his voice sharper now, no longer lazy or indifferent, no longer detached from the reality unfolding in front of him. "You're in trouble, and you didn't even bother telling me?" My mother hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to come up with a way to spin this, a way to make it sound like a misunderstanding, a way to paint herself as the victim rather than the manipulator. "We didn't want to worry you," she finally said, her voice soft, placating, the same tone she had always used when she needed him on her side. "You have your own life, your own responsibilities. We didn't want to burden you with this." I laughed, the sound dry, humorless, shaking my head as I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Right," I said, tilting my head slightly, watching them squirm, watching the cracks start to form in the careful image they had constructed. Because worrying me was so much better. Because making me feel obligated to fix this was the only option. Eric's expression darkened, his posture shifting as he straightened, as he turned fully to face them, his voice cold, sharp, no longer holding even the smallest trace of the easygoing charm he had always used to get what he wanted. "So let me get this straight," he said, his words slow, deliberate, each one landing like a hammer against the brittle foundation of their excuses. "You needed money, and instead of coming to me, instead of even telling me what was going on, you went straight to her? After everything?" My mother's face twisted, her lips pressing together tightly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she could physically hold on to whatever control she had left. "We thought," she started, but Eric didn't let her finish, cutting her off with a sharp laugh, shaking his head as he ran a hand through his hair. "No, I get it," he said, his voice laced with something bitter, something resentful, something I had never heard from him before. "You knew I wouldn't give you a damn dime." The air in the room shifted, the weight of his words pressing down on them, forcing them to sit in the reality they had been avoiding. For the first time, I saw something crack in my mother's carefully controlled expression, saw something flicker in my father's eyes, saw the unmistakable realization that they had backed themselves into a corner they couldn't escape. I let the silence stretch, let the moment settle, let them feel the full weight of what they had done before I finally spoke again, my voice calm, unwavering, final. "You want my help?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, watching as my mother inhaled sharply, as my father looked away, as Eric crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "Then you admit everything. Right here. Right now." My father said nothing, didn't even look at me, but my mother, for the first time, looked truly shaken, her eyes darting between me and Eric, her hands tightening into fists against the table as if she was fighting some internal battle she had never prepared for. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging, her gaze dropping to the table as she whispered something so quiet I almost didn't hear it. But when I did, everything changed. For a long, suffocating moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that swallows everything in its path, the kind that presses against your chest like a weight you can't shake, the kind that makes time slow to an unbearable crawl. My mother sat there, her lips still slightly parted, her hands still clenched into fists against the table, her entire body tense with the kind of regret that doesn't come from actual remorse, but from the realization that she had just made a mistake she could never take back. I saw it in the way her eyes widened just slightly, in the way she inhaled sharply as if she was about to try and walk it back, in the way her fingers twitched like she wanted to reach out, to undo what had already been said, to take back the words that now hung in the air between us like a noose waiting to tighten. "We didn't want you. You were never meant to be here." The weight of it crashed over me all at once, drowning out everything else, muting the world into a dull hum, making it hard to breathe, making it hard to move, making it hard to exist in a space where the truth I had always suspected had finally been spoken out loud. I had known, deep down, for as long as I could remember, had felt it in the way they looked at me, in the way they spoke to me, in the way they treated me like an obligation instead of a child, like something they had been forced to deal with rather than someone they had chosen to love. But knowing it in the back of my mind, carrying it as an unspoken truth I had never been able to fully confirm, was one thing. Hearing it said so bluntly, so carelessly, so easily, as if it were a fact as simple as the weather, as if it were nothing more than a statement of reality rather than a knife being twisted into my chest, was something else entirely. The air in the room shifted, the tension thick enough to choke on, the weight of my mother's words settling over us like a suffocating fog. My father remained silent, his gaze locked on some invisible point on the table, his hands folded in front of him, his entire posture stiff with something that looked too much like indifference, too much like resignation, too much like the quiet confirmation that he had known all along and had simply never thought it was worth saying out loud. He didn't argue, didn't correct her, didn't try to deny the truth she had just let slip, didn't even flinch at the sound of my breath hitching slightly in my throat, didn't do a single thing to suggest that he disagreed with what she had just said. And that, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know. Eric, who had been leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, radiating his usual brand of detached irritation, suddenly shifted, his posture stiffening, his expression twisting into something I had never seen before. Something that almost looked like shock, something that almost looked like understanding. For the first time in his life, I think he actually saw me, not as the sibling who had always been there in the background, not as the one who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, not as the one who had walked away because I was too sensitive to handle the way things were, but as someone who had been carrying something unbearable, something cruel, something that had never been meant for me to hear, but had shaped my entire existence nonetheless. "You." He hesitated, his voice quieter now, his usual arrogance tempered by something more uncertain, something more fragile, something that made his next words almost hesitant. "You actually meant that?" My mother swallowed hard, her gaze darting toward him for just a second before she looked back at me, her expression flickering between defensiveness and something that almost looked like regret but didn't quite reach far enough to be real. I didn't mean, she started, her voice cracking just slightly, but I didn't let her finish. I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound of the legs scraping against the tile cutting through the silence like a blade, my movements deliberate, controlled, purposeful in a way that made my mother inhale sharply, in a way that made my father finally glance up at me, in a way that made Eric's gaze flicker between them and me as if he was still trying to piece together how deep this ran, still trying to understand something that had always been painfully clear to me. "You know what?" I said, my voice quiet, steady, sharp enough to cut through the thick air between us. "I think I finally get it." My mother flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite figure out what, as if she was waiting for me to give her a way out, a way to fix what had just happened, a way to make me pretend that this moment had never existed. For years, I had carried the weight of their rejection, had let it seep into my bones, had let it shape the way I moved through the world, had let it convince me that if I just tried hard enough, if I just proved myself in the right ways, if I just made myself useful enough, they would finally see me as someone worth loving. But now, standing here, looking at them, seeing the truth etched into every tense muscle, every unspoken word, every unwilling glance, I realized something so simple, so freeing, so utterly undeniable that I felt it settle into my chest like a weight lifting instead of pressing down. I owed them nothing. I didn't owe them my time, didn't owe them my energy, didn't owe them my money, didn't owe them the chance to explain away what had just happened, didn't owe them another second of my life spent trying to prove something that had never been mine to prove in the first place. I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders back, feeling the tension leave my body as I straightened, as I let go of something I had never needed to hold onto. Then, I looked my mother directly in the eye, meeting her panicked gaze with a calm so absolute it made her flinch. "You never wanted me," I said, my voice quiet, final, carrying the weight of something that had been waiting far too long to be spoken out loud. "And now, you don't have me." My father inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening against the table, his posture going rigid as the full weight of my words settled over him, as the realization finally hit that I wasn't just talking about this moment, that I wasn't just angry, that I wasn't just trying to hurt them back. I was done. Eric remained silent, his expression unreadable, his gaze flickering between me and our parents as if he still couldn't fully process what had just happened, as if he was seeing the cracks in the foundation of his world for the first time. But I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked toward the door, my heart steady, my steps firm, my breath coming easier than it had in years. And as I left them sitting there in stunned silence, I knew, without a doubt, that this time they would never see me again. I had always imagined that walking away from them for good would feel heavy, that it would sit in my chest like a weight pressing down, that it would somehow make me feel like I had lost something, like I had finally severed the last fragile thread that connected me to them. But as I stepped out of that room, as I let the door close behind me, as I inhaled the crisp, sterile air of the hospital hallway, all I felt was lightness, an unbearable, indescribable relief that settled deep into my bones. Something so freeing that I almost laughed right then and there. For the first time in my life, I wasn't tangled up in their expectations, wasn't drowning in their disappointment, wasn't trying to prove my worth to people who had never seen me as anything more than an inconvenience. For the first time, I was making a choice for myself, and it felt nothing like loss. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me long before I had ever understood what it meant to have control over my own life. But, of course, it wasn't over yet. I still had to make it official, still had to take the final step, still had to ensure that there was no possible way for them to drag me back into their chaos, no last-minute manipulation, no sudden shift in tactics, no desperate attempt to guilt me into undoing everything I had just done. So I walked straight to the hospital's billing office, calmly stepped up to the counter, and told them exactly what needed to happen. "I won't be covering any of the charges," I said, my voice even, unwavering, final in a way that left no room for argument. "I know my parents listed me as their emergency financial contact, But that was not done with my consent, and I have no legal obligation to take responsibility for any of their medical expenses. The woman behind the desk blinked at me, momentarily taken aback, probably expecting a frantic relative willing to drain their entire bank account to keep their family afloat. I could see the moment she realized that I wasn't one of those people, the moment she understood that I wasn't here to negotiate or argue or beg for more time. I was simply here to remove myself from the equation entirely. Understood, she finally said, her tone shifting into something more professional, more detached, as she began typing into her computer. We'll update the records to reflect that you are not a financial guarantor for their account. Your parents will need to work out their payment options directly with us. That was it. That was all it took to walk away from the responsibility they had tried so hard to place on my shoulders, all it took to erase the last lingering obligation they had attempted to force upon me. No more phone calls, no more demands, no more expectations that I would be the one to fix their mistakes. I turned to leave, feeling that same lightness return, that same steady, unshakable calm settling in my chest. But before I could take another step, I heard the sharp, familiar sound of my father's voice cutting through the air. Wait. I didn't turn around immediately, didn't let him see any reaction, didn't give him the satisfaction of thinking he had caught me at a weak moment. When I finally faced him, I saw the tension in his jaw, the tight set of his shoulders, the barely concealed frustration in his eyes. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being the one without control, wasn't used to being the one left scrambling for an argument that might still give him the upper hand. We're still your parents, he said, the words clipped, forced, more of a command than a plea, as if saying it out loud was supposed to mean something, as if those words alone were supposed to make me forget everything that had led to this moment. And that was when I laughed, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, not out of humor, but out of something sharper, something bitter, something that tasted like years of frustration finally releasing into the air. Because that was all he had left, wasn't it? That was his last card, his final desperate attempt to remind me of an obligation that had never been mine to carry. He wasn't apologizing, wasn't admitting fault, wasn't even trying to understand the damage they had done. He was just expecting me to fall back in line because that was what he thought family was supposed to do. Eric, who had been standing a few steps behind him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, finally let out a slow exhale, running a hand through his hair, shaking his head as if he had finally reached his own breaking point. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice filled with something exhausted, something raw, something that sounded dangerously close to regret. For years, Eric had lived in a world where everything was handed to him, where our parents had protected him from consequences, where he had never needed to take responsibility for anything because they had always been there to catch him when he fell. But now, he was seeing what happened when their safety net was gone, seeing what it looked like when they had no one left to rely on, seeing, maybe for the first time, exactly how much they had taken from me while giving him everything. And he wanted no part of it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, not in a dramatic exit, not in a grand display of anger, but in quiet, exhausted resignation in the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had finally realized that the foundation he had been standing on his entire life had never been as solid as he thought. I watched him go, not feeling sympathy, not feeling satisfaction, just feeling a quiet sort of finality, a certainty that whatever connection we had as siblings had been severed the moment he had chosen ignorance over understanding. He had never stood up for me, had never cared enough to see what had been happening right in front of him, had never questioned why I had left until it was too late. And now, he was making the same choice I had made all those years ago, except this time, it wasn't just me he was walking away from, it was them. I turned back to my father, watching as his expression flickered between anger and something unreadable, something that might have been regret if he had been capable of it, something that might have been sorrow if he had ever truly cared. But it was too late for that now, too late for anything he could have said, too late for anything he could have done, too late for anything other than the truth that had been waiting far too long to be spoken. Maybe I said, my voice steady, unwavering, unshakable in the way that only comes from knowing you have finally freed yourself from something that was never yours to carry. You should have treated me like a daughter instead of an investment. And with that, I turned and walked away, not looking back, not waiting for a response, not letting myself wonder if I would ever see them again, because, in the end, it didn't matter. I was finally free.